From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Wednesday, May 27th, 2015. Acclaimed international journalist Charles Glass joins us to discuss the latest on Syria's devastating civil war. Glass's new book is entitled Syria Burning, ISIS and the Death of the Arab Spring. And we'll turn to Bernasek and D.T. Morgan, authors of All You Can Pay, How Companies Use Our Data to Empty Our Wallets. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Sonali.
The Israeli Air Force bombarded 4 areas in the besieged Gaza Strip with airstrikes earlier today, apparently in retaliation for rockets fired by the group Islamic Jihad into Israel. Israeli officials blamed Hamas for the rockets, inspiring fears within Gaza of yet another war, less than a year after Israel's devastating 2014 attack. Meanwhile, Amnesty International has just accused Hamas of committing serious crimes during that war last summer. The rights group claims that Hamas used the cover of the war to conduct summary executions to, quote, settle scores after accusing victims of collaborating with Israel. In the midst of all this, Israeli officials are celebrating the fact that the U.S. just blocked an expansion of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that would have shone a light on Israel's nuclear weapons stockpile. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu thanked U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry in person. Bob, does Israel seem to be recovering from its brief pariah status on the international stage, with increased focus on Hamas and the U.S. seemingly back in its court?
Right. You know, it's not really the international consensus that matters. It's the U.S. consensus. And we're seeing this play out again. For all the talk that Obama was holding Israel's feet to the fire, I think we're seeing how superficial that is. The Israelis are also talking about starting a peace negotiation with the Palestinians by dictating which settlements they're going to keep on the West Bank. I mean, this is business as usual. I think it shows that the superficial differences between administrations, Obama versus Bush, really don't matter. The United States is committed to Israel and its predominance in the Middle East, and I think we aren't going to see that change very much, unfortunately.
And 17 people are reportedly dead in Texas and Oklahoma over the Memorial Day weekend as severe storms hit the 2 states. Firefighters rescued hundreds of people who were trapped in their cars due to unexpected flooding. Houston, Texas alone received a foot of rain in a short time. Rick Flanagan, the emergency management coordinator for the city, said, quote, given the magnitude and how quickly it happened in such a short period of time, I've never seen this before. More than 1,000 homes have been destroyed and more than a dozen people are missing. Meanwhile, in India, an unprecedented heat wave is killing people and even melting roads. Temperatures of nearly 122 degrees Fahrenheit have led to 1,100 deaths across a number of states, in particular Andhra Pradesh. Elderly and homeless people, as well as those working outdoors in the construction industry, have been hit the hardest. Indians are waiting desperately for the annual monsoons to provide some relief. Bob, are poorer nations likely to see a greater impact from climate change?
Not likely to see, but are seeing. This has been documented and this process is ongoing. We had floods here in Austin, Texas, where I live, and as I walked and watched the creek rising, I had a very visceral reaction to what it means to live through so-called natural disasters in the relatively affluent first world, especially the more affluent sectors of the first world, where you're protected in so many ways. And of course, this is just one more place where the ecological and the social come together. The consequences of injustice in the human family play out in the way that we deal with these ecological crises, and that's going to continue and, in fact, intensify.
And finally, early this morning in Switzerland, authorities arrested at least 8 FIFA officials, sending shockwaves through the world of international sports. FIFA is the global governing organization for soccer and oversees the World Cup, the most popular sporting event in the world. The arrests took place as FIFA officials convened in Switzerland for their annual meeting and were conducted at the behest of the U.S. Department of Justice for accepting $150 million in bribes over more than 20 years. U.S. prosecutors are alleging that officials, quote, shut out competitors and keep highly lucrative contracts for themselves through the systematic payment of bribes and kickbacks. At stake are the processes by which FIFA awarded the 2018 and 2022 World Cup locations to Russia and Qatar. FIFA President Sepp Blatter was not among those arrested. The U.S. Attorney General is expected to hold a press conference today to explain more. Well, Bob, given what a huge corporate industry such sporting events like the World Cup have turned into, are you surprised that there may have been kickbacks?
Well, what a surprise here. What do we know about professional sports? We know they jack up the prices and disrespect consumers. So-called loyalty doesn't exist. We know that they exploit players, that they are unconcerned about safety. We see that with the concussions and the traumatic brain injuries. And we know now also that they engage in kickbacks and other kind of corporate crime. So what we know is that the business is what matters. Sports is a lovely thing, but it's the business of capitalism that, of course, is so corrosive. Thank God we still have amateur sports here at places like the University of Texas, where our football team is amateur. That was a joke. Okay, never mind.
Well, Bob Jensen, thank you so much, as always, for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
My guest is Robert Jensen. He is our daily newsflash guest expert. And by the way, just a quick reminder, if you are a TV viewer to Uprising, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. We need to be able to continue to fund the TV operation of Uprising. Funds have actually run out, and we're not going to be able to do this for much longer unless we get many hundreds of you signing up for a very tiny amount of money, just $4.99 a month, to our YouTube channel to get exclusive access, fund drive free programming. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Pentagon officials last week came the closest they have come so far to admitting that U.S. bombs killed Syrian civilians in the months-long war launched last year. An investigation into a November 2014 airstrike launched this January found evidence for the deaths of at least 4 children, among them a 5-year-old. Dozens of deaths have been attributed by news reports to U.S.-led airstrikes on Syria, a country that seems to have one overlapping war on another ever since a war broke out with the advent of the Arab Spring rebellions. The Islamic State militant organization, whose explosive rise prompted a U.S. air war, announced that it has taken over a key Syrian city of Palmyra, home to 65,000 residents and precious ancient artifacts. ISIS is estimated to be controlling about 50% of Syria now, even as President Bashar al-Assad's troops are waging a brutal war on rebel groups and the civilian population. And as in all wars, civilians are caught in the crossfire. My guest is Charles Glass. He has reported extensively from the Middle East and traveled frequently in Syria over several decades. His books include The Northern Front, a wartime diary about Iraq, and The Tribes Triumphant, a book about his time in Lebanon and when he was kidnapped by Hezbollah and held captive for 3 months. His latest book is called Syria Burning, ISIS and the Death of the Arab Spring. Welcome to Uprising, Charles.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. I want to begin with the history of the U.S. in Syria that most of us are not aware of, and that goes all the way back to 1949, when the U.S. CIA fomented a coup in Syria over what else but oil. Can you tell us that story and how that set into motion political instability in Syria in the years and decades following?
In 1948, there was a proposal to build a tap line, it's called tap line, an oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia through Jordan and Syria to the coast in Lebanon. The Jordanians and the Saudis and the Lebanese agreed immediately, but the Syrian parliament wanted to discuss the terms and wanted to negotiate for better terms from the Arabian-American oil company. The United States didn't really like that, and the British didn't like it either. They approached the chief of staff of the Syrian army, Colonel Hosni Zaim, a Kurd as it happens, and Zaim agreed to stage a coup d'etat, thus overthrowing the parliamentary democracy that Syria had had. From then on, throughout the 50s and 60s, Syria had one military coup after another, some sponsored by the CIA, some sponsored by the Russians.
Right. You mentioned in your book that the U.S. made two more major attempts in the 1950s to decide Syria's future, with Operation Straggle and Operation Weapon. Both failed. What were these operations? Why did they fail? And was the ongoing U.S. interference in Syria through those decades centered on oil politics?
Well, as Wilbur Crane Eveland, who was one of the CIA operatives working out of Beirut at the time, wrote, he was taking suitcases full of money to some Syrian officers when they were caught. And if the Syrian intelligence services hadn't caught them on that occasion, those two coups would have been successful. There were many other coups that were successful, but the regimes were always short-lived until 1970, in the last military coup by Hafiz al-Assad, who was the commander of the Air Force, an Alawite from northern Syria. And he established a regime that is, through his son, still in power today, although he's in power in a much smaller part of the country than his father controlled. In terms of oil politics, that was really 1949 was really the only crucial stage in Syria's history where oil was decisive in a change of government. Syria has barely enough oil on its own territory for domestic consumption. It's not a big player in the oil world like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates.
So Hafiz al-Assad, whom you just mentioned, of course, father of Bashar al-Assad, there's a history of the Assad family of crushing rebellions, is there not? If we look back on this history, I suppose Bashar al-Assad's role in the last few years should not surprise us.
No, I don't think Bashar ever considered leaving power voluntarily. I mean, he would only go if he were driven out or if the country were able to have a free and fair election, which it's never had, by the way, and he lost. But in the absence of those two possibilities, he's going to stay until he's driven out.
Now, let's talk about the current war, which began when, as you say, the Arab Spring turned into the Syrian winter, a rebellion that began in 2011 when people protested the imprisonment of a number of teenagers in the city of Daraa who had been accused of writing anti-government graffiti. And you write about how this rebellion really started out as largely peaceful, a mass rebellion, and people perhaps naively being quite optimistic that their mass peaceful movement could foment some positive change in Syria.
But it wasn't the arrest of the students that caused the uprising to begin. It was actually the torture of the students.
Right.
The people in Daraa thought, while they were willing to accept arrests and they were used to being mistreated by the security services and adults had been tortured, it was something new that children would be tortured. And they demanded in the streets that this be stopped and that the governor be dismissed. The governor, who happened to be a cousin of Bashar al-Assad, stayed in for a time, and Bashar didn't want to be seen to concede anything to the demonstrators because he thought that would be showing weakness. Many months later, he did dismiss his cousin, but he didn't put him on trial or hang him, which is what the people in Daraa would have liked. By that time, the rebellion was in full swing, and it turned from nonviolent demonstrations all across the country, nonviolent demonstrations in Daraa and Homs and Damascus, and there was great hope in those early months that first, that Assad might reform the system, and second, that they might be able to force him out of office.
But then you had the emergence of, even before the Nusra Front and ISIS, in those early days of the war, you had the emergence of the Free Syria Army, you had the Syrian National Council, and eventually those groups decided to begin accepting arms from outside countries. How did that transition happen from...
Well, they didn't decide to accept arms later. They were offered arms almost from the beginning.
Right, from the beginning.
There were debates within the people who were sponsoring the demonstrations, debates amongst them whether or not they should respond to government violence with violence of their own. And many believed that they should, that the only way to answer weaponry was with arms. Others said no, that non-violent
but serious civil disobedience struggle would be better, because the regime knows how to deal with violence. It had been dealing with violence since its inception. It crushed the Muslim Brotherhood rising in Hama in 1982 very successfully. It probably killed 10,000 people in Hama in the process. So the government was prepared for that. But what it wasn't prepared for was civil disobedience, general strikes, people not cooperating with the government. That might have been something more difficult for them to handle. However, because some people wanted to take up arms against the regime, and outside powers, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other Sunni powers which fear non-Sunni regimes in the Arab world, were offering them money and weapons. And so many of them took it, and it went from being an uprising, a civil uprising, to being a civil war.
And so, Charles, was that their first and biggest mistake, to accept these arms?
It depends on whose side you're on. I'm not on anybody's side. I'm an observer. I like Syria. I know that someday all the Syrian people are going to have to come to terms with one another. However, if the goal was to reform the country and have a more transparent state, probably it was a mistake, because basically there's no country left. More than 200,000 people have died. More than a third of the population has been left homeless. Hundreds of people have been beheaded or eviscerated by the Islamist opposition. The regime has tortured thousands of people. The place is really in such a mess, economically and in human terms, that it must have been a mistake to start a war. I mean, anything is better than the status quo. One of the problems with it was that the opposition never had the strength to overthrow the regime, and similarly, the regime never had the strength to defeat the opposition. So the war goes on and on.
Right, and you wrote that the rebels calculated that as in Libya, NATO would ensure their swift victory. The U.S. decided that the regime was so unpopular that the rebels would overthrow it without NATO help. And you said both were wrong. You write this in your book, Syria Burning. And then, of course, emerged ISIS, the Nusra Front first, and then the declaration of this group ISIS by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And that changed the whole equation. It suddenly drew in those same powers who were helping the rebels into a war that is now benefiting Assad. Is that a sort of a fair assessment?
Well, two things happened. One, what you've just said, and the other was that the United States had some success in its nuclear negotiations with Iran. Now, remember that the reason the United States wanted to depose Bashar al-Assad was not because he was a dictator and not because he tortured people, because all of its Arab client regimes do that. I mean, the regime in Baghdad does it, the regime in Riyadh does it, in all of its client states this happens. So the reason was because Bashar al-Assad was an ally and a client of Russia and of Iran. But with improving relations between Iran and the United States, the raison d'etre for American support of the opposition in Syria evaporated. They're still giving support to some what they call moderate rebels, supposedly to take on ISIS on one side and the Syrian regime on the other, but I don't know of any group that's actually moderate or is fighting the government at the same time it's fighting ISIS. This is a kind of fantasy. However, it has left the United States with an incoherent policy. It hasn't quite decided what it wants in Syria. It knows what it wants in Iraq. It wants to destroy ISIS in Iraq to protect a client regime in Baghdad. But in Syria, they're willing to see the very people that they're trying to defeat in Iraq survive and go on to fight the regime, because they've turned a blind eye to Saudi, Qatari, Turkish support for ISIS and to the Nusra Front, which is the official al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria.
Now, the U.S. has been sort of reluctantly, at least under Obama, appeared to be reluctant to get involved in a Syria war until ISIS came about. Meanwhile, you've had Russia and China who have vetoed one UN Security Council resolution after another, trying to hold the Assad regime accountable. So let's turn to how the big powers have the role that they have played in Syria, because your book points out the layers upon layers of involvement and political interference in Syria at the sort of macro scale. You have these big powers. What are the motivations? I mean, we just discussed the U.S. a little bit. What about Russia and China? Why are they interested in propping up Assad? Charles, we just lost your audio. We're going to have to call you right back. My guest is Charles Glass, actually speaking to us from Paris, France, and we're talking about his book, Syria Burning, ISIS and the Death of the Arab Spring. And the book is quite a short book and yet lays out in pretty great detail the various layers of the Syria war, the history of Syria, the history going all the way back to the 1930s and 40s in Syria, and also the all the way up to the emergence of ISIS and the U.S.'s involvement there. Charles, can you hear me?
Yes, I can
Okay,
hear you.
great. Okay, so let's talk about why Russia and China might have been are supporting Assad.
Well, if you look at the map of the members of the Arab League, which stretches all the way from Mauritania in the west to Iraq in the east, every one of those states is an ally of the United States, except Syria. Syria is a Russian ally and has been since the 1960s. Now, the Russians aren't going to give that card up for nothing. And the United States has not offered them anything in order for it to be even tempting for them. When Kerry and Lavrov went to Geneva in January last year, they had nothing to talk about because they didn't have a plan for Syria. All they wanted to do was make the case, one anti-Assad, one pro-Assad, and then leave. But in fact, what they need to do is to sit down and come up with a plan for a transition in Syria to another government someday, but with elections and a resolution of this problem. However, no one outside is doing it. So the Russians and the Iranians arm the regime, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Americans, the Turks, the UAE are arming the various opposition groups. And the people who suffer, of course, are the Syrians, whom no one has consulted.
You write in your book, Syria Burning, quote, if the revolutionaries are exhausted, so is the government. More tired still are the country's civilians who have borne the brunt of the suffering. And I'm wondering if the presence of ISIS in this last year or so sort of served to totally derail the rebellion and sabotage their cause. If both ISIS, if both Assad and the non-ISIS rebel groups and even civilians want an end to the war, ISIS has inadvertently succeeded in sort of shoving them all into the same corner?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but I can say that ISIS has some support among some Sunnis in Syria. Assad himself has support among some people of all persuasions, whether Shiite or the dissident Shiite sects like the Druze, the Ismailis, the Alawis, and the Christians, the Armenians, the Kurds.
So what you're saying is it's not as simple as ISIS against everyone else?
It's not as simple at all.
Okay.
And people change sides and people defect from one group to another. Many foreign fighters have gone for the money, many have gone for ideological reasons, many because they're psychotics and they see a chance just to kill people or to rape women, as they did when they kidnapped thousands of Yazidis and enslaved the women and turned them into sex slaves. What they've been doing is horrendous on both sides, but it seems particularly public and particularly worse in the ISIS-controlled areas and in some of the Nusra areas where, for example, they drove out the Armenians last year from the village of Kasab and they had to take refuge in Latakia. The policies of the outside powers, their proxy wars they're fighting through these groups, and including the Syrian army, it's a very dirty game in which I think most Syrians would not like to take part, but in which some of them are indeed taking part.
Now, where does the Free Syrian Army stand today? How does it distinguish itself from ISIS while continuing to, in a way, fight towards the same goal of trying to topple Assad?
The Free Syrian Army has become irrelevant. The funding and the arms are going to the extreme Islamist groups, mainly Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. The Syrian Army is no longer a significant player.
And so let's also talk about where the weapons that al-Nusra and ISIS are fighting with are coming from. Would it be fair to say that some of those weapons are actually American weapons that are given to these fighters previously through U.S. allies and weapons buyers?
ISIS seized many American weapons when it took Mosul and other areas in Iraq, weapons that had been given sold to the Iraqi army by the United States. The Iraqi army, as you know, fled without a fight and left its weapons intact for them to seize. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been supplying them with modern armaments, and most recently with American anti-tank weapons, which they used successfully in taking Ramadi and Palmyra in the last couple of weeks. And it seems that Obama has turned a blind eye to the Saudi, Qatari, Turkish supply of those weapons to these Islamic fundamentalist groups. He met recently with leaders and foreign secretaries of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, including Saudi Arabia. But he didn't make this an issue with them. He was simply trying to sell them on his nuclear agreement with Iran.
So you have U.S.-made weapons in the hands of groups that the U.S. is now leading a war against.
You have American weapons. You also have Russian weapons. AK-47 is the most popular light automatic weapon, and everybody on both sides has that. They come from Russia.
Now, let's talk about the fact that Syrian civilians in particular have received the brunt of the impact. They've paid the heaviest price, and you point out how children, in particular Syrian children, have been so deeply impacted. And the medical infrastructure in Syria, you pointed out in your book, has been destroyed. How has, is that something that has been a sort of deliberate targeting that you've seen in Syria, that hospitals and ambulances, etc., have just been devastated as a result of the war?
I've never covered a war where both sides didn't bomb hospitals or schools. I've never seen any army, whether it's the Israeli army or the Iraqi army or the Yugoslav army, that did anything to protect hospitals and schools. If people fire from them or fire near them, they will bomb them, and that's happened in Syria. Both sides have hit hospitals.
There have been an unimaginable number of refugees, about 40% of the population displaced by the war. And you write, for many refugees, the rallying cries of the regime and the armed opposition ring equally hollow. What do Syrian refugees want at this point today? I mean, it must just be horrifying to imagine the situation that they're in.
Well, most of them want simply to go home and resume their lives. I mean, many Syrian people, particularly in the countryside, were not very political. They suffered a lot from a drought that began 5 years before the uprising began, and a lot of people had moved from the countryside because there was no work for farm laborers into the shanty towns on the edges of the big cities, and a lot of discontent came from that. I think if the war ended on whatever terms, people would want mostly to go home. Some people won't go home because of terrible things that they've seen or fear of reprisals for things that they've done or alleged to have done. And many of the people in the refugee camps have gone back in to join one opposition group or another for revenge because they've lost someone at the hands of the army.
Now, there are Palestinian refugees who've been living in Syria for a long time, who are already a stateless people to begin with. What has the war meant for them?
Well, particularly in Yarmouk camp, which is the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Damascus, it's been right at the front line, having changed sides several times between government forces and opposition forces, and they've been caught in the middle, both sides wanting them to fight for them, then trying to stay out of it. I mean, they were driven there in 1948 when the Israelis expelled them from Palestine, and they really have had nowhere to go. Some have gone to Lebanon, but the Lebanese don't welcome them with open arms. Some have gone to Jordan and gone into new refugee camps in Jordan. Their plight is, I mean, doubly tragic because they've had to go through this in 1948 and again now.
Right. You write in your book that you had a friend in Syria whose house was destroyed by both the rebels and by Assad's forces. Can you share that story with us and how it's, in a way, symbolic of where people or how people are caught between two sides in this war?
Well, he had a house in the mountains. This was very early in the war. And rebel units went and put a mortar position up on his roof and started firing at the regime. And rather than wait for the regime to fire back, they then evacuated the house. And the regime, of course, responded by shelling the house and destroying it. So he can hate both sides because one side fired from his house and drew the fire, and the other one actually did the firing. And I think many, in a way, that symbolizes what many Syrians are going through.
Right. Let's talk about the fact that there has been some diplomatic effort, aside from the UN Security Council and the vetoes by Russia and China. The UN Arab League has at least attempted on paper to address this conflict, first under the leadership of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and then Lakhdar Brahimi. Did this UN Arab League do anything constructive on this war?
I don't think Kofi Annan did much. Lakhdar Brahimi did a lot. He brought the sides together. He got them all to come to Geneva to discuss a settlement, but he couldn't get the UN Security Council. He couldn't get the Russians and the Americans to agree on a plan that they could impose on the squabbling Syrian groups. I think Lakhdar did a lot. Now Staffan de Mistura, his successor, is in Syria trying to negotiate local ceasefires, at least to give some respite from the fighting for people in various neighborhoods in Damascus and Aleppo. And in that, he's had some success, but without the backing of really the United States and Russia, they can't achieve their ultimate objective, which is to end the war.
So at this point, there are also divisions within Syria that you point out in your book, that where there was once more unification among Syria's population, whether they were Christians or Alawites or Sunnis. There are divisions now that are heightened. What is that? How did that come about in general, sort of briefly, and what does that mean for Syria's future?
Well, as happened in Iraq after the American invasion of Iraq, when one sect starts to fight another, people moved out of the neighborhoods where they felt unsafe, where there were a minority. So Kurds moved into Kurdish areas and Arabs into Arab areas, Shia into Shia areas, and so forth. Well, the same pattern has happened in Syria. People no longer feel safe because theoretically the other side is out to get them, even though there were neighbors and friends at one time. It's been terribly divisive in the rhetoric of many of the opposition members that they want to dispose of the Alawite minority entirely, dispose of the Christians, dispose of the Armenians, dispose of the Druze, basically dispose of anyone who's not a devout Sunni Muslim of a Wahhabi persuasion, terrifies those people in Syria who are not, and it's very hard for them to form coalitions with the Sunnis. When the uprising began, there were members of the peaceful opposition of all sects, including the Alawis, even though the president is an Alawi. But that is vanishing, because, as one Alawi friend told me, he says, I was against the regime, but now I have no choice because the others are out to kill me just because of who I am.
Right. So inadvertently, we've seen Assad, whose regime has been shown to flout international law through the use of terrible weapons, be stronger as a result of what's happening on the ground.
I wouldn't say he's stronger. He's lost control of 50% of his territory, and his economy is shambles. He's not strong in the sense that he was strong in 2010 before this all began. He's stronger. He's strong enough to stay in power. He's strong enough to hang on to parts of the country. And he has the support of people who maybe not necessarily support him so much, but support the state, the unity of the state, support state institutions, because they don't want to see that crumble, the army crumble the way it did in Iraq with the chaos that entails. But he represents the state, so they're stuck with him.
Well, finally, Charles Glass, how do you have any thoughts on how this devastating war may proceed? It doesn't seem like it can get much worse, and yet there doesn't seem much hope for it to get any better.
The fighting, I suspect, will go on until one side is strong enough to defeat the other. But as long as the outside powers go on giving pretty much equal weapons deliveries to both sides, the war could go on for years and years. The same thing happened in Lebanon. But when the outside powers finally got tired of the war in Lebanon, it didn't suit Iran's purposes anymore, it didn't suit America's or Russia's purposes anymore, they forced the Lebanese militia leaders to go to Taif in Saudi Arabia and sign a document for a new Lebanese constitution and an end to the war. Most Lebanese leaders didn't like it, but they had no choice because they were going to lose all of their funding and all of their weapons. If someone could persuade the United States and Russia to do the same thing in Syria now, then slowly the Syrian war could also come to an end.
So basically, the hope is for the big powers to lose interest in Syria?
No, I would say to take a genuine interest in the welfare of Syrians rather than their own interests in destroying Syria for short-term victories.
And that will be really interesting to see that happen, because we don't have much precedent for that, do we?
Well, I think the Taif
right, what you just mentioned. Right.
Lebanon is a very good one. Or the talks that ended the war in Yugoslavia. Also, nobody was happy. No, the Yugoslavs were not happy with that. But it ended the war. You can go anywhere in former Yugoslavia now and drive without being stopped at checkpoints and being shot at, which was a big improvement for all Yugoslavs.
Well, Charles, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your thoughts on Syria based on your many years of reporting. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
My guest, Charles Glass, is an acclaimed reporter and journalist who's reported extensively from the Middle East. He travels frequently in Syria and has done so over several decades. His books include The Northern Front, a wartime diary. It's a book about Iraq, and The Tribes Triumphant, a book about his time in Lebanon. His latest book is called Syria Burning, ISIS and the Death of the Arab Spring. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A new report recently found that product pricing in the U.S. remains very confusing for consumers. While the Federal Trade Commission has a Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, many industries, especially food, are exempt, and inconsistency is actually the norm. But this is perhaps by design. U.S. corporations are enjoying a situation where consumers are confounded by complex labeling and fine print and contracts that transfer more and more of the burden onto them and lacks government enforcement of existing standards. In a new book entitled All You Can Pay, co-authors Bernasek and D.T. make the case for how companies are using data that they gather about people to determine the highest price they can squeeze out of them. It's an insidious story of corporate surveillance, among other things. One reviewer said, All You Can Pay is a truly devastating critique of today's information-based predatory capitalism that everyone must read. Indeed, it's arguably the Das Kapital of the 21st century. Anna Bernasek writes the Data Points column for the New York Times and is a writer for Newsweek. She's covered economics and business as a journalist and author for more than 20 years. And D.T. Morgan is a lawyer based in New York, specializing in finance and corporate transactions. The two of them are co-authors of the new book, All You Can Pay, How Companies Use Our Data to Empty Our Wallets. Welcome to Uprising, Anna and D.T.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Now, companies have always wanted to know information about consumers and traditionally had called it market research. How has the digital age, not just the fact that we do so much of our shopping online, but just the fact that we communicate so much online, changed the way or enabled companies to have more access than ever before to market research data?
Well, I'm going to jump in, Sonali, first and just say, I mean, what we have now is like an unprecedented situation in that companies really know everything about us or can potentially know everything about us. And that's what's really unusual. Dan, you jump in. And
Yeah, the scale of the data collection has increased in a geometric way. So the amount of data that's being collected today and that we expect to be collected in the near future is really rapidly growing.
And so I remember there were a time when consumer sort of loyalty supermarket cards were what companies used to gather data, for example, on what you might buy to shop for groceries in your house. But it seems like a dream come true today for them to be able to sift through all our communications, the things that we click on, the things we look at, but also what we mention or might mention in our emails to one another as indicators for what we might want to buy and how much we might want to pay. Dan?
Yeah, that's very accurate. It turns out that the best consumer loyalty card system is actually your mobile phone. It follows you everywhere. It keeps a record of where you are in real time, and it tells a lot about what you're doing and what you have done. When you combine that with the other platforms, tablets, PCs, and then all the offline stuff, it's really a massive amount of data that's being collected. I think people are generally aware that there's a concern with the government use of this data, but we actually think that the private commercial use is much more significant.
Right, so much information and exposés over the past year or so about how government and the National Security Agency are snooping on Americans in the, in order to protect, they say, national security interests. But people don't seem as concerned about the fact that Google can and does read your email. So Anna, tell us a little bit about Google, this very interesting company that has taken it upon itself to essentially control much of the internet. They read our email, but we can't read their emails.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you would be outraged if somebody opened your regular mail. So there's absolutely no difference with your email. And Google has said, well, it's not read by a person, as if that's supposed to make us feel any better. And in actual fact, it's worse because, using computers, using technology, it's far more accurate reading of it. And this ability to read it, to process it, to save it, and to use it at record speed is just an incredible development. So, in that sense, it really is like a huge violation of your privacy. And the irony too is it's not just if you use Gmail, if you're a Gmail user, but if you send an email to a Gmail user, your email will be read by Google.
And Google also reads emails that we ourselves may not read. We might see an email that we decide we don't want to read and just drop it in the trash. Google's still sifting through that?
Right, absolutely. They will read everything that essentially is sent to you or you send to somebody. And when you think about what you're including in those emails, such personal things, it could be about your dreams, your hopes, your fantasies, your home life, your personal life, and compiling all that to make a very sophisticated profile about who you are, what you want, what you do, what your resources are. It's phenomenal.
What does Google do with all this data? What do companies who track the information, track our communications, do with all the data? How do they turn that into their profits, which of course in turn is turned into wallet gouging for us?
Okay, Dan, you jump.
Dan?
Yeah, we're really at the beginning of the business use of the data. The technology has run ahead of the ability of the businesses to actually fully exploit it. So they're still figuring out how to do it. Right now, if you look at the main methods that companies are using on a massive scale, it's what they call targeted advertising. So Google will show advertising based on your web searches, your emails, and basically every other source of data that they have, which is very extensive. Now that sounds relatively benign, but what we want to remind people is that advertising is actually not the right word anymore. When you see an online advertisement or an ad on your mobile, or even your web searches, it's all personalized to you. So what's really being set up is a situation for individual customized negotiation, one by one, with many millions of people at the same time in a way that was never possible before.
That's right. And I think, Sonali, what we're seeing is there's been this big shift in these two trends colliding in the economy. One is the disappearance of the mass market being broken down until there's really businesses are trying to get to a market of one-to-one selling where they're just negotiating with you. And at the same time, the second trend is the rise of the big data and technology and, powerful analytics. So they know everything about you. And when you combine that with a one-to-one selling and somebody on the other side that knows everything about you, they can really use it in ways to make you pay and make you pay higher prices.
So give us an example of that and how much of that is happening right now. Are you suggesting that, say, if I click on a pair of shoes that I might consider buying, you know, obviously I start to see these same shoes pop up on the ad bars of every search that I do because someone has kept track of it. Eventually, are we going to get to a time when someone somewhere, some algorithm somewhere will have determined through all the information it has about me what it would take to get me to buy those shoes? What price tag would push me over the edge to buy those shoes? And all of a sudden I start to see that and I buy it, and there's that successful transaction that has been sort of tailor-made for me. Is that what you're suggesting is going to happen? Is it already happening?
That's exactly right. And we believe it is already happening. It is not particularly visible because the companies do a very good job at maintaining their own privacy and their own secrecy. So they're not announcing exactly how they're using the data. We think this is a more or less obvious application. We are confident that it's happening now. It's difficult to prove. It's very expensive to do a broad survey. It's something, quite frankly, we wish the FTC were more interested in. But it's something that is happening. One of the things, there are many different clues to it. If you look back at the old technology, before the internet, we had mail order catalogs that came around to people's mailboxes, and they were, you know, offered shoes, for example, that they could buy from a catalog. Well, there's ample evidence that the catalog companies were sending different catalogs to different people. There was a publicized case with, I believe it was Victoria's Secret. Am I right on that, Anna?
Right, that's right.
Where they were sending different catalogs to people in different zip codes because they presumed, probably correctly, that people in different zip codes had differing means and were able to pay higher prices in some cases. So if they were already doing that, even before the internet came to where it is today, you can pretty well bet that they're doing that now, but in a way that's difficult to report because we only see what we see. I can't see what you see.
Well, the other thing, Sonali, is it's happening in airlines. You go on the internet, you go and book a flight, and what's happening is you're getting a price just for you. You're not getting a market price. When you go on Kayak or you go on whatever website and book your plane trip, you're getting a price that is the price that's offered for you at that particular moment in time. And I don't think that people really appreciate that because I think that they think, oh yeah, that's like the average price, or that's the market price, or that's what somebody else would get if they were asking at this point in time. And that's not what's happening.
Are you suggesting that companies like Kayak might use, for example, my history of having paid $350 for a ticket somewhere to offer me a ticket at about that same price because they know I can pay that much, whereas someone else might have gotten the exact same ticket for $250?
Well, first of all, I think that a company like Kayak, Expedia is a similar company. I think those companies are not the leaders in this field. They are not the biggest of the data giants. There is, however, nothing to stop them from doing exactly what you're describing. Whether they're doing it today is something that I don't think we have the ability to say, but there's certainly nothing to stop them. And I would be surprised if they haven't experimented with it.
So let's talk about the fact that you start your book asking people how much you would pay for air. And the fact that it sounds like such an absurd question to us until we think about the fact that water, which all of us need to survive just as we need air to breathe, is something that companies have successfully commodified and, you know, put into plastic containers and sold to us. So how do we get from where we are today to a future world? If left unchecked, how could companies literally sell us the very air we breathe?
That's a good question.
Well, you know, I believe you have out on the West Coast, we have a couple of examples here in New York of oxygen bars, where in effect it's quite similar to selling air. We know there's a commercial business in compressed gases, so you can buy actually air in a bottle, usually for an industrial purpose. People would be buying nitrogen or air, that sort of thing. But it's not a consumer product. I mean, nobody realistically goes to the supermarket to buy air. However, I would say that, about, when would it be, almost 40 years ago, nobody would go to the supermarket to buy water.
So let's talk about the fact that this idea of dynamic pricing, as it's called, is something that companies are very reliant on. It's what their bottom lines are increasingly based on. Isn't this something that governments should be protecting us from? What essentially amounts to, from the consumer perspective, price discrimination through the use of serious corporate surveillance, both aspects of which are pretty unethical?
Well, the thing about, I think that price discrimination is really a topic that we're going to be hearing more and more about. The problem here is that the economics profession itself doesn't have an answer for price discrimination. If you listen to some people, they'll say, oh, it's just efficient for the market to work that way. And other people say, no, it's actually market power. And when you have market power, you're distorting outcomes. So the economics profession has been actually very behind, I think, on what's been happening in consumer markets with the whole technological revolution. In terms of the government, I think then they've also been very behind. Price discrimination laws, or price gouging laws, we used to call them, are only really in existence in times of natural disasters, for the most part. So we really don't have any sort of legal framework, I think, to deal with this. And, that's when, Dan and I were scratching our heads about, well, how do you actually go after this problem? Because when a company knows everything about you, they can charge you the most you're willing to pay. And at times, charge you the most that you have. And, we thought in the end, it really comes down to consumers really understanding what's happening and coming together and demanding change. And I think that is going to be the way then government will start to listen and start to respond.
And how have consumers inadvertently, in a way, allowed or enabled our current situation to come to where it is? I mean, just if you look at the disparity in how people react to corporate surveillance versus government surveillance, there's this tacit understanding that it's okay if it's a corporation surveilling us, or it's okay for us to pay, or accept more legal responsibility when we enter into a contract if we get a cheaper price, etc. Have consumers sort of been inadvertently complicit in this situation we have today?
I think that's absolutely right, but partly because companies have made it difficult to see and they haven't been explicit about what they're doing with our data. So that's number one. Number two, they've also been very shrewd in terms of framing it as discounts. Oh, we're collecting data on you so that we can give you the best deal possible. We can give you a discount. But a discount today is the possibility of being charged a lot more tomorrow. And that's what people are not understanding, that, okay, you might, get some kind of a discount, but the power to give you a discount is the power to charge you more. And I think that is like the other shoe that has to drop with people.
And it's really interesting because, of course, people do chase discounts. But if we stop and think about why companies would simply give money away, if we look at the motives for corporations, their profit motives, there's no other reason that companies would offer discounts to consumers unless what they were getting was worth more than what we're giving up.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right.
Dan, did you want to jump in?
Well, with the consumer role, I think that consumers have been very complacent on this. And I'm sympathetic with that. Anna and I use many of the web services that are very popular, whether that be Google, which we've mentioned, Amazon, Facebook, our cell phone provider. Many of these big companies provide services that, if they're not absolutely essential, they are nearly essential for participating in our modern society. Many of those services, however, came in an era before the concerns about big data and the real effective use of big data began to be concrete. So take something like Google. When Google first started out, they didn't show advertising at all. They didn't even seem like a business. It just seemed like a wonderful service. Once people became habituated to it, all of a sudden it became a business. And it's, frankly, been one of the best businesses in all history. So I think that's going to increase. I think that we're going to see companies like Google continue to prosper. I don't begrudge that to them. They do some pretty special stuff that benefits a lot of people. But I would like to see a healthy ecosystem evolve where consumers are not treated in a way that is inappropriate.
Well, finally, what are things that people can do about this, short of first raising awareness that this is a problem, which, of course, I'm assuming your book is written for that effect. But are there, for example, ways for people to pressure the Federal Trade Commission or any consumer agencies or agencies in the government that are supposed to protect consumers, where people can pressure the government to crack down? Because the government is our representative. And if we pressure the government to crack down on these kinds of practices, it might be the fastest way to stop it in its tracks.
Sonali, we think that it's time that consumers take back the power. And Dan has a great idea, which we will have up and running in a couple of days. Dan, you jump in.
Yeah, sure. So just to frame it a little bit, it would be wonderful if government would solve this problem and we didn't have to think about it. But the reality is that government is us, and our representatives in Washington or in Sacramento or in Albany are not going to do what we want unless we essentially demand it. So raising consciousness is important, and communicating with our government is important. But I'm not sure that's going to do it. I think it's a very challenging subject, and what we are proposing is that consumers do it directly. And we're going to establish a website. It's called myuseragreement.com. It's currently under construction. It should be live in about 5 days from now. And on that website, it will offer consumers what I think is, for the first time, an opportunity to actually do something. You go up and sign up for your own terms of use.
Well, I want to thank the two of you so much for joining us today. MyUserAgreement.com is the name of that future website, and the name of the book that my guests have written is All You Can Pay: How Companies Use Our Data to Empty Our Wallets. I want to thank you so much, Anna, Bernasek, and D.T. Morgan, for joining us today.
Thanks
It was
so
a
much.
pleasure. Thanks a lot.
This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Daniel Swerdlove is our technical director. Kiana Turner and Federico Garcia are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.